Today, we're going to discuss something ironic, how better listening can lead to better articulation. But before I get into that, just listen to this clip.
There's an ancient and well-known philosophical riddle that asks, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it still make a sound? A scientific view is that while a tree will make waves in the air, to make a sound, it takes an ear to hear it. So my question is, if a person speaks, if they offer a TED Talk, for example, and no one listens, is that really communication? Listening, I believe, is the missing half of communication. Absolutely necessary, but often overlooked.
So I keep trying to observe people to understand what I can take from their communications and apply it into my own. And over the years, I've noticed the people that I observe who I tend to look up to the most from a communications perspective are the ones who tend to speak only after listening completely. And that has a lot more layers in it than I realized. These are also the people we often turn to for advice, we turn to for venting, and those who we tend to trust the most. Because these are the people who are able to respond in the most effective manner. So that's what we're going to discuss, how better listening can lead to better articulation. We're going to get into the science behind good listening leading to good articulation, what deep listening is and how you can practically apply it in your life, and 2 deep listening techniques that you can start putting into action immediately. And by the way, if you're new here, my name is Riddhi from Frantically Speaking. We release communications content regularly, so if you're into that, hit subscribe. And if you want to take your communications learning to the next level, you can click the link in the description to check out our courses and see if we can work together. So let's get started with the science behind deep listening. Now, a lot of us think deep listening has to do with the general concept of, okay, we let somebody finish, we completely hear them out and then respond. But that can get a lot harder unless we break it down into actual steps. So I tried to do that, but I realized that I still wasn't being able to improve my responses for the other person. And that's until I actually realized that we need to change our overall mindset towards deep listening. So what that means is, instead of thinking about listening or speaking, we need to switch to the value question. The value question simply means asking yourself, in this conversation, how can I add the most value to my listener? When you approach any communication from that perspective, you allow yourself to be completely open to what the other party has to say and only respond afterwards. Because good listening is not about having good vocabulary, fluency, or confidence. It's about fundamentally understanding that listening and communications comes down to 2 aspects: relevancy and clarity. So the more we ask the value-based question, we're able to respond with more relevancy and more clarity, which in turn helps us to be a lot more articulate. Because better listening is equal to being able to ask better questions, which equals to being able to extract better information, which equals to you being able to sound as articulate as possible when it is your turn to speak. And that is the fundamental breakdown of deep listening. But how do you actually apply it into your everyday life? Because a lot of us think that deep listening is all about nodding along when the other person is speaking, not being on your phone and not looking away, making eye contact. And all of those are fine, but we already know all of that. Instead, I like to layer my listening with something known as the podcast technique. It simply means when you're speaking up, you want to pretend like you're in a podcast with this person, that you are the host and you've called them as a guest. This mindset allows you to ask better questions as opposed to the mundane stuff. And a good podcast host always allows their speaker to complete what they have to say before they get to their next question. If you think of the world's greatest podcasters, you take a Joe Rogan, for example, and you wonder why he is at the top of his game, even after years, is simply because he can ask better questions, because he is intensely listening to the other person. You can actually feel genuine curiosity coming out of each episode, which allows for better and more interesting questions. So the next time you're in a conversation, try to apply the podcast technique and try to pretend like you are the host, they're the guest, and you're trying to extract the best possible information out of them. So how do you practically apply deep listening techniques in your everyday life? There are 2 techniques I want to discuss today. There are a lot more, but each of these techniques are going to help you listen better so that you can respond with more articulacy. And the first one is called as labeling. This is a technique that I learned from a book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Amazing book if you haven't read it already. And it'll show you how to use labeling to extract better information from the other person. It simply means to label a particular emotion that you think the other person might be feeling. Let me break this down through an example. Let's say if you're running a meeting and you're planning something, and you notice one member of your team who's just unusually quiet, and you don't know, you think that their mood is off, or they're disagreeing to what you're saying, or they're feeling afraid to speak up. Now, without applying labeling, we might address the situation in a less conducive manner by saying something along the lines of, hey, why aren't you saying anything? Do you have a problem with the approach? But if we use labeling, we can start our phrase with, it sounds like, or it feels like. And our approach would then become, it seems like there might be some hesitation around this approach. Now, we can follow that up with a question which directly says, is there anything you want to add to the conversation? But generally, labeling by itself makes the other person want to speak up. And it might be that we're completely wrong, that they're not hesitant, they are just having an off day, and they're not being able to bring a better energy to the meeting. Which is why using phrasing like it seems like or it feels like helps us to have the room that in case we are wrong about the label we're giving to them, they can easily correct us without the conversation becoming confrontational. And confrontation, when done incorrectly, is one of the killers of deep listening. So we want to avoid that. And the second technique that we can apply is called the Jigsaw Technique. This simply means that when somebody is speaking to us, we want to treat the conversation like a jigsaw puzzle. That we're trying to get a bunch of information to be put together so that we're able to communicate and respond in a much more structured and relevant manner. Let's say, for example, somebody comes to us and says, now, bad listeners will directly start with their advice and they'll start giving their best tips and tricks for this. But a good listener will instead try to ask more questions to understand the situation properly so that the response is a lot more relevant. So in the case of this example, we can ask things like, okay, what is exactly stressing you out? Since how long have you been feeling like this? Is there a particular person that causes more stress than the others? And the more we fill in this puzzle, the more relevant our answer will become. And that's how you're able to change your mindset, your technique, as well as practical application into deep listening skills. And if you want to know how you can mix this in with storytelling, we've created an amazing video using the example of Amir Khan, which you can check out right here.